Hey everybody, welcome to A Jewish Jawn, a podcast where I interview emerging artists in Philadelphia about how they, as a young person, experience Judaism today and how Judaism impacts their artistic practice. I'm Zoe Nebraska Feldman, an actor, intimacy choreographer, and person who works in video and photo production. My first guest is Molly Gorelick, and this is episode 1. Hi, everybody. Welcome to A Jewish Jawn, our first episode. Thank you, my mom. My mom gave me that one, truly.
She did a good job.
I think so. We're here today with Molly Gorelick, who is a poet, professor of writing at Temple University, also an MFA candidate, socialite, barista, charming pop culture aficionado as well.
Wow, I just got the chills. Such a nice introduction.
Molly and I met at Fits and Starts.
Rest in peace.
RIP.
I miss it.
I do too. I think also one of the things where I was like, Molly, we found like right off the bat that we had a connection through Park School of Baltimore. Mm-hmm. It was a teeny tiny school where I'm from, that your mom also attended. Not at the same time.
But. Not at the same time. But yeah, I remember she was telling me that at the time she was there, it was like the only private school that allowed Jewish people and Black people to go there.
It wasn't necessarily a Jewish school, but definitely had Jewish cultural influences. But yeah, Molly, tell me a little bit about where you're from. And yeah, let's start there.
Yeah, so I have lived in Pennsylvania my entire life, except I was born in New Jersey, but we don't need to touch on that too much. I was raised in Yardley, Pennsylvania. Lived there. I went to Dickinson College in central Pennsylvania in Carlisle. And now I'm here. I've been living in Philly for almost 3 years now. And yeah, I'm just a Pennsylvanian through and through.
Molly wrote this amazing chapbook called Shiva Call Time. And a huge part of this chapbook is written in gibberish.
I was very heavily inspired by the Jewish Borscht Belt comedian Sid Caesar. He was very famous for doing these gibberish impressions. So he would do impressions of different languages. He would do like Italian and German, and he wouldn't actually be speaking in those languages. It would just be gibberish. And the crazy thing about that is that he would be doing it live or in a sketch or something. And even though nobody had any idea what he was saying, they would be laughing.
Oh my gosh.
And so seeing that or hearing that audience reaction was fascinating for me because it was all dependent on his actions and the cadence and what we expect to hear when we're listening to a joke. Or he'd throw in English words or words in German or Italian or something that we would be able to understand as kind of like this grounding moment in the humor. So my gibberish in Shiva Call Time came directly from that. I wanted to see, it was kind of an experiment of like, can I do homophonic translations of Yiddish poems, which basically just means translating the Yiddish into English words that sound like the Yiddish, and just see what would happen for an audience experience. And these poems that I, quote, translated are by these late 19th century Eastern European woman poets who were writing in Yiddish.
I don't think I knew that they were all women.
Yes. Oh, yeah. That was very intentional. I was going through a deep dive on the internet. I was like, I don't know if I've ever been aware of any poets writing in Yiddish. And I was like, I know there has to be a Yiddish poetic tradition. Like, Yiddish is just such an expressive sounding language.
In general, I feel like as an artist, I have so like few and flimsy connections to other Jewish artists from the past.
Yeah.
How have you been finding connections with other Jewish artists like currently in are there other Jewish artists in Philadelphia who you're connected to?
Well, my best friend, Sammy Polinsky, we went to college together and we lived together in Philadelphia for a year. She's currently living in Boston, getting her MFA from the SMFA school at Tufts. And she studies visual arts. I don't know exactly what Sammy's degree is going to be in, some sort of mixed media sculpture. I mean, she's kind of a jack of all trades when it comes to the like building physical objects, but she's currently making a lot of art just based on Judaism, a lot of plays on words and interrogations into, I think, what it means to kind of be more of a secular Jewish person, where you have, you know, all of this culture that you wouldn't be the same without, but not necessarily practicing it religiously. You know, where one of us lacks in skill, the other can pick it up. Like I was telling you earlier, I'm not really a visuals sort of person. I can't, you know, I'm more of a words person, and she is great at the visuals and the physical objects. So she would always ask me to help title her pieces. But my favorite of hers is this amazing sculpture called matzo ball soup. And it is like a gravity bong full of fake matzo ball soup.
That's incredible.
And it's amazing. And she does all of these sorts of things like that. I told Sammy, I was like, you can use whatever of my stuff you want to use to make a physical object. So recently, Sammy made these mirrors with one of my poems from Shiva Call Time etched into it. So it was really cool that even though we're not physically in the same space right now, we can still have that collaboration because we have this shared language based on how we were raised.
Yeah,
we have the same lexicon. Because you don't have to explain things to each other, which is really nice.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's definitely something that I feel there's this impulse to like explain my Judaism to people. Like, I feel like I use the corny joke all the time. Like, I'm Jew-ish.
I describe it as like, you know how Christians are like, oh, I'm an Easter and Christmas Christian, where they like only go to church on those days. I'm a Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur Jew, where like those would kind of be the only days that I go to synagogue.
A Passover Jew.
Passover is my favorite Jewish holiday.
Me too.
Yeah. It's incredible.
It's the best. And you brought up a really good point earlier, tying into Passover.
Yes.
We were talking about connecting Jewish and artistic identities.
Yeah, so I was talking about the four children, the four types of children in the Haggadah of Passover. And there's, you know, these not really flattering descriptions of the first three children. There's the simple child, and there's the curious child who asks important questions. And in my growing up, curiosity was so prioritized. And I think that having that attitude towards life, you need to process that somehow. And I think for me, I write through it. My roommates and I were talking about weird things that we did as children. And I was like, I don't know, like I've always been my own brand of weird, but I don't know, like if I did anything that crazy as a kid. I was just a ham. Like my dad called me a kosher ham.
Oh.
So, yeah, so that was his little joke. But back to the story. I texted my parents and I was like, what was the weirdest thing I did as a kid? And they were like, well, you would go up to strangers and ask them to read to you.
Can you talk a little bit about what inspired you to write Shiva Call Time, or the process of beginning writing this
Yeah.
book?
I have a very small family. Half of my grandparents died before I was born, and the other half I just didn't get to know too well. And I really wanted to feel a geographical closeness and a spiritual sort of closeness to my family. And I thought, why don't I try and write through it? So originally, this project was going to be more about being Jewish and Philadelphia, and being Jewish in Philadelphia. And I was going to be looking at buildings, and I decided I didn't really want to write about buildings. And I was talking to my father, and at that time I was reading a lot about Jewish comedians and watching their sets, specifically Borscht Belt comedians who performed in the Catskills. And
What is the Borscht Belt for?
the Catskills.
Okay.
Like, there were all of these kind of like adult sleepaway camp sort of things, like in Dirty Dancing, where families would go and Jewish comedians would perform there. So I was watching Alan King and Sid Caesar and others, and I asked my dad, I was like, did your grandmother or your mom like any of these comedians? And he was like, the women in my family were very serious. They had been through a lot, but your grandmother had an experience with Alan King where he performed a charity event at her synagogue after my father's father died, her husband. And she said it was the first time that she laughed after her husband died. And that kind of became the premise for this fictionalized relationship between my grandmother and Alan King in the chapbook.
It's also interesting to me that you have letters that written from the persona of your grandmother, or in your grandmother's voice, to Alan King, but not letters written from Alan King to your grandmother.
Yeah, I really wanted to focus on audience in this chapbook. I think about audience a lot because I really see poetry as an exchange between writer and author. And I'm kind of writing about this stand-up comedian, and I'm writing about the performance of comedy and the performance of death, and how as Jewish people we perform comedy in the face of death so often, as is our favorite, maybe not even coping mechanism, but just as a way through things, or as a way of processing trauma.
Yeah, I mean, it just feels like at this point just like a language pattern. Even.
It is. Like we were talking about interrupting. It's the same thing. In other cultures, it's rude, but for us, it means you're engaged, and we understand that. But in terms of audience, whether it's the people who survive a dead person, or my grandmother seeing Alan King, because I was thinking about this kind of parasocial relationship that I wanted my grandmother's persona to have with Alan King. And I kind of wanted there not to be a sense of closure for this caricature of my grandmother. I wanted this fantasy to exist because, she's mourning and she's imagining what Alan King's life is like as this comedian, and she can communicate with him without expecting anything back. And I think that in poetry, I think there's this misconception that it's this very insular thing. You write a poem, you're by yourself, that it's very lonely. And I think there's this misconception that sometimes mourning can be that way too. And in Judaism, we have the Shiva, and it's very communal, and there is this sort of audience. And I think I like to look at poetry in the same way, whether it's you're at a reading, or you are in a writing group, or whatever, there's a sense of community to me that's very important, whether you're getting feedback on your writing, or you are mourning with others at a shiva, or you're in the audience experiencing a cultural event with other people. Those experiences would not be the same if you were just having them by yourself. And I think community is so important in Judaism, and it's important for me in poetry as well.
It's important in art in general, I feel like.
Because it's so easy to fall into that isolation.
Yeah. Or like the feeling that like what I am trying to express is something that only I feel.
Oh, yeah.
And so maybe this, like the fear of like maybe this won't resonate with an audience, or like that it's not going to spark a conversation. And I think all good art to me like sparks a conversation, even if it's just like an internal one in someone else.
And for me recently, I've been asking the question of myself, like, how can I in my work prioritize community over the individual who's just writing the poem? How can I make this a shared experience? And I, am figuring out the answers as I go, but it's just something that I've been keeping at the forefront of my mind. How can I make this about community?
Yeah. I love that. I really love that, because I also feel like there's a ton of ego in art making. Like, first off, you have to have the delusion that like what I have to say is important in the world, which is not a delusion. I feel like everybody has something important to
True.
contribute,
I think being delusional helps, though. I think I'm definitely delusional.
No, I'm so narcissistic. I'm fully. You have to accept that part of yourself.
Of course.
Losing this part of the ego for art making, and really focusing on making art in service of a group. That's another thing that I have been thinking about in creating this podcast, is like using it as a way to like build community, using it as a way to find community.
My professor, the poet Jenna Osman, who also grew up in Philadelphia, she, at the end of our workshop the other day, she said something about using play and fun and experimentation as a way of kind of subverting this capitalist idea of writing. And I think that, prioritizing togetherness in the process of writing just really can help accomplish that. And I think if we shift this idea of making art is an isolated practice, people can just create so many wonderful things together.
As an actor, I feel like that idea of joy resonates so much, because even if you're doing like a difficult or a dramatic role, or like frustrated in a rehearsal room with the process, which can also often feel so like sluggish, like always finding a sense of joy and a sense of play, a sense of humor.
Well, I love when people don't take themselves too seriously. But I am thinking back to something you said before we started recording about like bringing your Jewishness into reading a script. And remind me what you were saying. You were saying something about...
So, we touched on with Passover the Curious Child, which is, I was so excited when you brought that up, because that is exactly what I had in mind when I was thinking about creating this podcast, and just like how my Jewish identity overlaps with my artistic identity overall, is like I explore and create through questioning, and like each question leading to an answer, which is actually just another question leading me somewhere else.
Oh my God, exactly.
As an actor, like reading a script, I'm always interrogating like the character's motives, the character's feelings, just sort of like scavenging around to find clues about like their inner emotional life and like why the playwright thought anything was important.
Because sometimes it's not obvious.
No, it's not.
Sometimes it's like, why was this worth writing about? But when you really get into it, it's like, whoa, we need to explore the mundane too.
Mm-hmm. And I think even if like in working with like new plays too, like often there's something, I'll like point something out to a playwright and they're like, that's very cool that you found that to be important. Like I had no clue that I was even thinking about that. But like, so even the accidents, I feel like treating the script, treating a book, treating a poem, like every like punctuation mark, every word, every line break is intentional and important and can tell you something else about like this person that you're trying to embody. Like
a general sense of nosiness as well.
Mm-hmm.
You know, just needing, and we were talking about, I was telling Zoe about the new narrative movement of writing, which kind of spanned 1977 to 1997. It's one of my favorite movements. I'm reading an anthology right now by the new narrative writers Dodie Bellamy and Kevin Killian. And there are a lot of Jewish writers in the new narrative movement, and new narrative is known as this very intimate, like raw, expressive, almost confessional, but very much about sexuality and daily life and people you know, name dropping other poets or whomever in the writing. And I was like,
That's dirty. That's dirty work.
And
but in the best way.
I love it so much because I feel like it feels like a time capsule. And I think a lot of poets are concerned with their writing being timeless. And I'm like, no, I want my writing to be so of the time that I'm writing in. And I love that about new narrative because it's just about kind of people they know. But there's this also difference in, you know, the I pronoun of the poem is not necessarily the writer. The speaker is not the writer. That's been drilled into me. And even though there is this sense of intimacy in the new narrative writing, it's very, you have no idea if it happened or not. It's this sense of intimacy that may or may not exist between you and the writer, which I love that sense of boundary almost, and that relationship between audience and writer that I find fascinating.
I want to throw you a curveball question.
Oh my God, please
just 'cause it like just popped into my head. Have you ever like read about like Jewish mysticism? Have you ever gotten into that at all?
So my senior year of college, I took a class on Kabbalah, which is kind of controversial because you're not supposed to learn about Kabbalah really until you reach the peak of Jewish scholarship. The very basics of Kabbalah that I learned about, it's just so cool. I understand why Madonna got into it.
It's fascinating. I honestly haven't gotten into it all that much, but I also feel like there's some connection there between like a Jewish identity and an artistic identity. The more I start, you know, digging through like what my relationship with Judaism is, there is so much in common between the two, and between this like and then there's this whole other part that's just like, ooh, like we've got woo-woo bullshit too. Like I'm here for it. I'm really here for it.
Yeah,
I didn't mean to call Kabbalah woo-woo bullshit, but
what I know about it is that it's a very advanced part of Judaism, and you're not supposed to go about it alone. I think you're supposed to have like a kind of spiritual guide taking you through the teachings.
Is it like
Kabbalah.
a one-on-one or like a community thing? Because that would be a really good note to end on. If it's like you need to have a community
I don't know, but I think you need that community support to guide you through this like spiritual sort of awakening, maybe. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. But yeah, I mean, there's so much. There's so much. So
Thank you so much.
thank you. This
We're
was
gonna,
lovely.
yeah, this was so much fun. This was our first one. So,
I know. I'm feeling pressure.
me too. Me too. But I think we did good.
I
I think
think
we did
so.
great. Pick up Shiva Call Time, Bottle Cap Press. I had a really amazing time reading it, and it's so cute. I just love having it. All right. We'll see you in 2 weeks, I guess.
Yeah.
Ah, that was insane.
Oh my gosh, I feel like I blacked out.
I did too. We're just two blacked out people. This blacked out for sure.